Good morning and welcome to the Irwin Mitchell and Reed Recruitment webinar on neurodiversity, disability and reasonable adjustments at work. My name is Sibylle Steiner. I am a partner in the employment team of Irwin Mitchell, and I am joined today by my colleagues Esmat Faith and Poppy Ford, and we're also joined by Maxine Abastin from Reed. Before we start with our talk about neurodiversity, I would like to hand over to Maxine to give us an introduction to the topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Firstly, thank you all for taking the time to join us this morning. I hope this session will be useful and provide you some valuable insight into navigating the world of recruitment and management supporting the neurodivergent community. Neurodiversity is a passion of mine as a mother of 2 autistic children, and in the role that I have, I see the challenges that individuals experience every day trying to navigate maintaining roles and also finding new jobs. Whilst there have been improvements in mindset and approach in a number of businesses, there is a long way to go to make this a business as usual acceptance. There is still an underlying stigma and fear that people are unable to share their disabilities. It's important to remember that everyone is different and no one size fits all. It's crucial to understand, however, that your business can benefit from understanding more about the neurodivergent community. If you could pop, you've popped the next slide on already, well done. At least half of employers are now adapting their recruitment processes and have recognised that traditional methods are no longer suitable on their own. Whilst this may not work for everyone, there are a number of businesses that have had fantastic results by providing questions in advance, making adjustments to interviews, putting candidates at ease by providing diversity and inclusion policies in advance. 42% of individuals feel comfortable declaring their condition at work in a recent survey, which has significantly decreased from previous years. That could be, sadly, as it was not disclosed at the beginning, that reasonable adjustments weren't put in place, or there may have even been simple things like personality clashes. It's important to understand that not everybody has an official diagnosis, so it's important through management of people that we can understand behaviours and triggers. At Reed, we aim to support that through our recruitment process and also with partnerships with our local community. On that note, I will hand back to Irwin Mitchell, who will provide you with a further insight into how you can support this in your workplace.
Thank you very much, Maxine, for that very helpful introduction. So if we could have our first slide, please, so that we can look at what is meant by neurodiversity. CIPD defines this as a natural variation in human brain functioning. And as Maxine said, all of our brains obviously work differently, and all minds are unique. Now, we have about, I think, 84 billion brain cells connected in billions of different ways, and we cannot expect everyone to respond in the same way to the same environmental conditions. What is included under the umbrella of neurodivergence is debated, but this will definitely include autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, and more. It might also include conditions such as bipolar disorder, depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, acquired brain injury, and so on. We will look into the more common types of neurodiversity shortly. The bottom line, however, is that we all need to do more to consider the fact that there are different thinking styles. It is estimated that 1 in 7 people in the UK are neurodivergent, but this could actually be as many as 1 in 5, according to CIPD. So potentially a very large proportion of a business's workforce. Someone who doesn't possess a neurodivergent identity might be referred as being neurotypical, although this is highly contextual and there is no one normal brain. If we could move to the next slide, please. It is therefore vital to understand some of the challenges that neurodivergent individuals can face in the workplace. And often these challenges will be exacerbated because the workplace is set up to cater for neurotypical workers, and there is potentially a lack of understanding or awareness of neurodiversity. We have listed a few possible challenges on the slide there, but it is, of course, really important to remember that each individual is different and will experience different challenges. If we could move to the next slide, please. And I think, Maxine, you mentioned this already as well, that whereas on the previous slide, we looked at challenges like difficulties or different types of social interaction and communication challenges and sensory differences. There are also strengths which can be associated with neurodivergence. And again, we have listed those or some of them on the slide that you can currently see. So the way to approach it also from a business point of view is that to think about that a neurodivergent thinker may be able to offer a different way of looking at a problem, potentially making processes more efficient, or is able to make connections that many neurotypical people will miss. The executive head and director and head of autism at work at JP Morgan Chase has been quoted as saying that our autistic employees achieve on average 48% or 140% more work than their typical colleagues, depending on the roles. There has been a huge focus over the past few years on equality, diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and the benefits of having a diverse and inclusive workforce are well known. And diversity of thought is a very important part of this. If we could move to the next slide, please. So despite the clear benefits that diversity of thought can bring to the workplace, there are still significant barriers for neurodivergent workers in accessing and remaining in employment. Historically, due to a lack of awareness and understanding of neurodiversity, our workplace processes and management practices, the work environments, and so on and so forth, haven't really been set up to accommodate neurodivergent people. And such neurodivergent individuals may find themselves marginalized by work cultures, processes, technologies, and which do not consider their sort of thinking styles. And as an example, only 3 in 10 autistic people, for example, are in any kind of employment. Now, while there has been an increasing awareness of neurodiversity, and employers are having more and more conversations about neurodiversity, there is still a lot to do. And we're hoping to explain in this webinar, based on what the law provides, what can be done by an employer to assist and to benefit from having neurodiverse individuals as members of the workforce. Also, embracing neurodiversity is becoming more and more expected by job candidates who are looking for work for a socially responsible organization, and the values and EDI commitments need to match the reality of working there. So neurodiversity is critical for the future of work, and it is therefore important that an organization does not get left behind. So if we could move to the next slide, we do have a Slido questionnaire on that slide. So if we could move to that, please. And so we would be grateful, please, if on a scale of 1 to 10, so 1 being not started and 10 being advanced, how far on your neuro-inclusive journey would you place your organization? There is a sort of slight time lag, so that's why I'm waiting a little bit for the results to come in. Okay, still changes. I think it looks like we've got a result now. So changing again. Okay. So we do have changes for sort of from second spot onwards, but I think throughout we have had the scale of 7. That was the biggest part with 29%. So fairly advanced, which is very good to see. So let's have a look now at some common neurodiverse conditions. So we briefly touched on autism and ADHD, dyscalculia, dyslexia, dyspraxia, or developmental coordination disorder. And if you could, so I'm not going through that list because I do think, and looking at our slide of response, I do think that you are all aware of these particular disorders. So let's just move on to the next slide, which says that around 3 in 10 neurodivergent employees haven't told their line manager or HR about their neurodivergence. And when asked why, 37% said that they are concerned about people making assumptions based on stereotypes. This is a survey by CRPD, and 34% said that there is too much stigma. And that survey outcome is probably not surprising. So what does that mean for a business? It does mean that where there is an individual, a colleague, an employee who is neurodiverse, it is important to speak to them about how the neurodiversity affects them, rather than going off on assumptions or stereotypes or common symptoms. As previously mentioned, a lot of the neurodiverse conditions are on a spectrum. So each individual has their own unique experience. And, well, for the sake of stating the blindingly obvious, a business is in the best position to support someone when they know their unique struggles and the conditions of their unique conditions. And equally, we will also stand to benefit from understanding how the condition impacts the way they process information. So that is by way of a brief introduction why neurodiversity in the context of the workforce matters, what the common neurodiverse conditions are, and I think very important that one should not base one's approach on assumption and stereotypes. And with that, I am now going to hand over to my colleague Poppy, who will take us through the legal definition of disability and whether a worker actually needs to have a formal diagnosis. Thank you.
Thank you, Sibylla, and good morning, everyone. So as Sibylla said, I will be covering the legal definition of disability and whether a worker needs a formal diagnosis in order to meet that definition. So I suppose the first thing that is worth me pointing out is that neurodivergence itself isn't a protected characteristic. However, neurodivergent individuals may fall within the definition of a disabled person under the Equality Act. And so you can see the legal test for disability on the screen there, but it's if an individual has a physical or mental impairment which has a long-term substantial adverse effect on their ability to carry out day-to-day activities. So that's a test I'm sure many HR professionals are familiar with, and that's the one that will apply even in cases of neurodivergence. So not all neurodivergence meets the definition of disability. It's a legal definition, not a medical one. And whilst occupational health can give a view as to the condition, whether it meets the definition, and we as lawyers can too, it ultimately is for the employment tribunal to decide who meets the definition based on that legal test on the slide. So since it is the requirement of the statutory test to determine whether or not a neurodivergent person is considered to be a disabled person, not all persons with the same neurodivergent condition will necessarily all be disabled or all not disabled. So, for example, an individual with mild dyslexia may not experience a substantial adverse effect on their ability to conduct normal day-to-day activities, but someone with more severe dyslexia is likely to experience that substantial adverse effect. So it really is looking at the person and the impact that their condition has on them, rather than the fact that they have the condition in the first place. In practical terms, it's also sensible for employers to assume that the individual with a neurodivergent condition is covered by the protections afforded by the Equality Act. And the reason that I say this is because it's not always going to be entirely clear-cut whether the individual falls within the definition. That will often turn on the extent of and the degree of the adverse effect, as I've just mentioned. But also treating all neurodivergent employees fairly and making adjustments where reasonable, irrespective of whether or not they're legally disabled, will be in furtherance of the overall agenda to promote diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So making reasonable adjustments for a neurodivergent employee and preventing conduct like harassment will also prevent other grievances or claims being brought against the employer. So it isn't just that legal element there, it's also that wider point of inclusion and diversity that is important. If we could move on to the next slide, please, Donna. Thank you. So does a worker need a formal diagnosis to be disabled? The answer here simply is no. Neurodivergent conditions are treated in the same way as any other physical or mental impairment when it comes to that definition of disability. So as we said before, that is, there's no need for a diagnosis. The tribunal will focus on the effect of the impairment itself. So thinking back to the definition on that previous slide, does the impairment have a substantial and long-term adverse effect on normal day-to-day activities? The tribunal will consider evidence, and that will include the claimant's own disability impact statement when coming to a conclusion. Generally, disability is not a high threshold to overcome, so it's just worth flagging that at this stage. So what about circumstances in your workplace where a worker doesn't have a formal diagnosis yet, or they've never mentioned any neurodivergence to you, but actually you think they're displaying signs and symptoms which cause you to believe they have a neurodivergent condition such as autism? So, for example, this might be impacting on their performance or the relationships. And to give an example, in the context of autism, that might be that the individual is having meltdowns due to a noisy and brightly lit working environment. So as I said before, we know that worker doesn't actually need a formal diagnosis to be disabled, and it's important to remember that that legal duty to make reasonable adjustments, which SMAT will come on to very shortly, that arises where you either know or you could reasonably be expected to know that that worker has a disability. So if you're identifying signs that the individual could have a disability, this shouldn't be ignored. So it could be a very sensitive and difficult conversation to be having, particularly if the worker doesn't know themselves that they have a disability, or even if they don't consider themselves to have a disability. They might also just be reluctant to discuss their health with you, but to properly support that employee and also protect the business against claims, it is important to be consulting with them to understand the impact of any potential neurodivergence on their ability to do the job, and also what adjustments are required to alleviate that disadvantage that they're suffering from. So it might also be necessary to involve occupational health, a GP, to help answer these questions. And as I said, we'll be going into a bit more detail about reasonable adjustments shortly. You may also find the opposite. So a worker might come to you with a diagnosis that they've actually obtained themselves, perhaps from Googling or looking, on the NHS website or something like that. And this is increasingly common due to waiting times for diagnosis and so on. So if an employee has self-diagnosed, for example, with ADHD, and then they ask for reasonable adjustments, if you're happy to grant those adjustments, then that's great and you can do so. But if you have doubts as to the diagnosis and you're reluctant to accommodate the requests, it's important to consult with that employee further to understand the effect of the impairment, and again, get that medical input so that you have a better understanding of the condition. It's really important, if you have doubts, that you do still consult with the individual and you do that first rather than just giving a blanket no. And again, that's because it's a low threshold to meet the definition of disability for employment purposes. And again, it focuses on the effect of the impairment rather than the formal diagnosis. So broadly, all of that to say, does a worker need a formal diagnosis to be disabled? No. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. This is just a very quick reminder on what you can and cannot ask about health and disability when you're recruiting. So just a reminder that it's unlawful to ask any job applicant about their disability or health until the applicant has been offered a job. So there are some exceptions, and we've listed those on the screen. So that will include where the question relates to their ability to carry out a function intrinsic to the job. But my warning here is to remember that this should be applied narrowly, because in practice there will be very few situations where a question about a person's disability or their health needs to be asked, as opposed to a question about their ability to do the job with reasonable adjustments. So rather than ask about a disability or health at the application stage, we recommend generally that you make it clear you're inclusive. An applicant should let you know if they need adjustments to the process. Again, it's about focusing on the effect of that impairment, if there are any adjustments that can be made, rather than the impairment itself and the condition itself. So I'm now going to pass over to SMAT, who will be chatting about reasonable adjustments in a bit more detail.
Good morning, thanks Poppy. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about what reasonable adjustments might be suitable to create a neuro-inclusive workplace. So a 2022 paper on autistic adults' experiences of workplace adjustments found that around a third of autistic employees did not request adjustments at work, but would have found them useful. Almost a third reported feeling unable to discuss their adjustment needs at all, and fewer than 1 in 5 felt comfortable discussing this across their whole organisation. There were difficulties requesting adjustments, including the onus being on the autistic employee to identify and advocate for adjustments, the risk of repercussions from the employer or colleagues, unclear organisational pathways, and perceived detrimental impact on other people. Where employees did request adjustments, over a quarter of these were refused. More than 1 in 10 respondents said the adjustment was poorly implemented, for example, that they had to continually fight to keep it in place. So this particular study related to people with autism, but many of these will apply to people with other types of neurodiversity too. To support neurodivergent people in the workplace to achieve their full potential, having effective conversations around reasonable adjustments is going to be the key. Many neurodivergent individuals, particularly as you're going to be encountering adults, they've learnt to mask their needs, and the difficulties that they're having might not be obvious at first. So creating an open and supportive culture where people feel comfortable talking about neurodiversity is important. We'll talk a bit more about that later. But people masking their symptoms, it can cause quite severe anxiety and depression and things like that. So it's really helpful to the person and to your organisation if you can support them to kind of be open about it, and then you can put in place reasonable adjustments to help them. If you advertise that you're willing to make reasonable adjustments, then neurodivergent individuals might feel more comfortable discussing their need for extra support when they are employed by you. Usually for a neurodivergent employee, their immediate line manager is going to be the person they will turn to first for understanding and support. The National Autistic Society has found that the best outcomes result from autistic staff having strong relationships with their colleagues, and they particularly found that the relationship with the line manager is key. So line managers need to be able to adapt their management style to meet the needs of individual staff members. And it might not be easy. They might not have much experience of this. It might not come naturally to them. And so it's really important that they get plenty of training and support themselves so that they then can support neurodivergent employees. They should also have a good understanding of the legal duty to make reasonable adjustments, an understanding of the often simple adjustments that they themselves can make. And we'll come to those adjustments later, some suggested things, but they aren't always necessarily going to be really big adjustments. It might be some quite small things that can really make a big difference. The line manager also needs to have a willingness to act as an advocate for their neurodivergent team members in securing them more substantial adjustments where those are required. One practical idea for employers is to provide line managers with an easily accessible guide to reasonable adjustments, or a best practice guide that they can follow with support from HR to develop a support package for neurodivergent staff. And the content coming up on the next few slides might help you in pulling together such guidance. Without this guidance, many line managers are afraid of getting the support wrong, and they might believe that they're at risk of a legal challenge. So we touched upon this duty on an earlier slide, but here's a useful reminder of when the legal duty to make reasonable adjustments is triggered. So it's where there's a formal or informal arrangement for work, a physical feature of the workplace, or a failure to provide an auxiliary aid, and this puts the disabled person at a substantial disadvantage when compared to a non-disabled person. And the employer knows or could reasonably be expected to know about the disability and one or two above. It's the employer's duty is to take reasonable steps to avoid the disadvantage. So for a reasonable adjustment claim to be successful, an employer must know or ought to know of both the disability and the substantial disadvantage. So, for example, in a case called Glasson and the Insolvency Service, which is a 2024 case, there was an employee with a stammer who applied for an internal promotion. Ahead of an oral interview, he notified his employer that he would need more time to complete his answers, and that was permitted. Another applicant ultimately scored higher than he did and was appointed to the role. Mr. Glasson sought to bring a claim based on the fact that he went into what he called restrictive mode, giving shorter answers to avoid stammering. Now, the employer had no knowledge of this disadvantage, and so the Employment Appeal Tribunal concluded that it was not required to implement further reasonable adjustments. However, if they had known about this, so if they'd known or could reasonably be expected to know, then they would have had to put some reasonable adjustments in place for that. And so I think it's quite important here, if you could reasonably be expected to know about the disability, then the onus is on the employer to investigate the matter further to ensure that any duty to make reasonable adjustments is complied with. And if you're not sure about things like that, we would definitely recommend that you take some advice. So what is reasonable? Could we have the previous slide, please? Thanks. So how do you know what's reasonable? Factors that should be taken into account are really, really important. Is, will the adjustment alleviate the disadvantage? If it won't alleviate the disadvantage, then that's not a reasonable adjustment. Is it practicable? How costly will the adjustment be? Does it disrupt the employer's activities? And it's about also the financial and other resources available to the employer. So if you're a small employer with minimal resources, then what is expected of you might be less than what would be expected of a much larger employer. But there are schemes such as Access to Work which can provide assistance, and so you would also need to investigate that as well as just thinking about what resources you have as an employer. And so that's the availability of external financial or other assistance. So Access to Work is one scheme, but there are others. Some of the charities, so autism charities and other neurodivergent charities, do offer some kind of financial assistance sometimes for making adjustments. The nature of the employer's activities and the size of the undertaking. So it will depend whether an adjustment is actually reasonable in relation to what the employee is required to do. Ultimately, the test of reasonableness of any step is an objective one, and it will depend on the circumstances of the case. So as I've said, what's reasonable for a large national PLC, for example, might not be reasonable for a small charity with 5 employees. You need to run through those factors systematically to work out whether any adjustments proposed are reasonable or whether they're not. If they're not reasonable, you'll need to explain why, referring back to those factors. The first of the factors is arguably the most important, because if the adjustment won't work in the sense that it will not alleviate the disadvantage in question, then arguably that adjustment is futile. It's really important to consult with the worker, potentially get some occupational health advice or the employee's GP, to get some kind of medical understanding of the nature of any disadvantage suffered and whether any proposed adjustment will alleviate it. You can also, if you get an occupational health report or you speak to the employee's GP or get a report, you can ask if they can suggest amendments that would alleviate the disadvantage. And that doesn't totally extinguish your duty as an employer. You still are required to think outside of those recommendations, but it can be really helpful to at least get some ideas. If it's not clear whether the adjustment will alleviate the disadvantage, then case law has determined that it might still be reasonable to take the step, notwithstanding that success is not guaranteed. That was the case of Griffith and the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions from 2015. A trial period is a really good way to deal with that. So rather than a blanket no, which risks a successful claim for failure to make reasonable adjustments, you could put in place a trial period of a few weeks, a month, maybe a couple of months, depending on what the adjustment is and how long it might take to understand whether that's working or not. Will depend how long you want that trial period to be. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk now about some examples of possible reasonable adjustments. Now, what's really important here is every case will be different and it depends on individual needs. So it's not really so much a matter of somebody comes to you and says they have ADHD and you've got a list of things that you can say, okay, these will definitely help you. But these are suggestions that you can make and you need to listen to what the employee says. Are these things going to be helpful for them? So the Buckland Review of Autism Employment, which is a recent report which was commissioned by the government into autism in employment, explains that for some people with autism, aspects of the work environment can be distracting or contribute to a sensory overload. So, for example, bright lighting, hot desking, high noise levels. So some autistic people may find constant attendance in an office stressful. Flexibility with start and finish times, quiet spaces for downtime, and working at home at least part of the time might be able to reduce that stress. As I've said, individuals will have their own preferences. Some of these adjustments that are on the slide may also be quite helpful for somebody with ADHD too. For those with dyslexia, the most helpful thing is quite likely to be specialist software such as speech to text or software which will read out passages of text for them. Mind mapping software might be helpful depending on what kind of work is done. Digital recorders, so rather than having to type out their own notes, they can record them and then play them back. Other adjustments that might be helpful might be colour filters, so whether that's on paper for putting over reading material, a different colour background on the computer, or different coloured paper, so printing out things onto different coloured paper. So that can help dyslexic people with reading, whereas a white page can be much more difficult for them. It might be that verbal instructions could be more helpful. So perhaps as well as sending somebody an email, you could sit down with them and explain verbally to them what they need to do. It might be helpful to confirm it in writing too, because then there's something to refer back to. Some people with dyslexia might have difficulties in prioritising work. So it may be helpful for them to have some planning time built into each day, perhaps with their line manager or another colleague, where they can sit down and just go through what they need to do each day. It might be that some things that are particularly reading or writing heavy, they might need some additional time to complete those tasks. So those kind of things could be reasonable adjustments. Things like noise cancelling headphones can be great if people find a noisy environment difficult. Providing a quiet space for downtime, so somewhere that someone can just go and shut the door and just really take some time to themselves, just recalibrate in their body. Regular short breaks can be helpful for some people. Advance warning of changes and advance warning of the agenda for meetings. So for some people with ADHD, for example, springing meetings upon them without them knowing what it's going to be can be really stressful. That can really cause them quite difficult symptoms. And so making sure that where there are meetings, they've got plenty of time to prepare for those meetings, and they are given a breakdown of what's going to happen in that meeting. And providing a mentor can be quite helpful. So it might be that they would prefer to just go to somebody who isn't their line manager for everything, who can just help them with things and help them talk through those things. Can I have the next slide, please? So we're going to go through a case example here on reasonable adjustment. So Mr. B worked as telephone advisor for a charity. He was given a trial in another team which provided advice via an instant messaging service. Mr. B did well in the role. However, his instant messages often contained spelling and grammar mistakes. When he was questioned about these errors, Mr. B said he suspected that he might have dyslexia and he was considering taking a test. Notwithstanding this, he said he was comfortable in the role rather than working on the telephones. Despite receiving good feedback from clients, the charity said that Mr. B's spelling errors didn't look good for the charity. They confirmed that Mr. B had failed his trial period on this basis, and he was told that he must go back to working on the telephones. Mr. B resigned and he brought a claim for failure to make reasonable adjustments. He claimed that reasonable adjustments would have included providing specialist software, a period of work-based coaching via Access to Work, extra reading time for reading and writing, and support with the written aspects of his job, for example, having a colleague proofread his work. He would have also benefited from receiving written confirmation of verbal instructions, and a quiet place for reading or writing anything that was complex, and having an electronic spell checker. In its defence, the charity argued that Mr. B didn't have any formal diagnosis and they would need this to understand what adjustments were necessary. Now, was Mr. B held to be disabled, and did he win his claim? I think we've got a Slido for this one, have we? Yeah, brilliant. So if you'd like to have a look at that and tell me, so was he disabled and did he win his claim? We're asking that as one question. Anyone else fancy voting? We're getting there. So so far we've got most people saying yes, but we have got some people saying no. So most of you are saying yes. The answer is yes, he was held to be disabled and he did win his claim. The case is Bulos and Shelter, the National Campaign for Homeless People, and that's a case from 2018. So we talked before about whether somebody needs a diagnosis. Now, in order to meet the test for disability, they don't necessarily need a diagnosis, and that's what happened in this case. The tribunal found that regardless of the absence of a formal medical diagnosis, Mr. B had made his manager aware that he was facing difficulties and that he suspected that he had dyslexia. So this was sufficient to give his employer constructive notice of his disability, i.e. that the employer could reasonably be expected to know about this disability. So the duty to make reasonable adjustments was triggered. The only adjustment considered was the return of Mr. B to telephone work, and this wasn't sufficient. Had Shelter considered other reasonable adjustments, it could have allowed Mr. Bulos to continue working via web chat. The tribunal considered that all of the adjustments suggested by Mr. B were held to be potentially reasonable. So I think this reiterates the point that an individual does not need to have a formal diagnosis to be regarded as disabled. The evidence of the spelling errors, plus Mr. B's suggestion that he might be dyslexic, was enough to give the charity knowledge of his disability and trigger the duty to make reasonable adjustments. So they should have investigated this, and they could have involved occupational health where necessary to understand what further support he required. So inclusion by design. So we've talked about the difficulties that can arise where an individual might be reluctant to disclose their neurodivergence due to fear of stigma or stereotyping, or it might be that the individual does not yet identify as being neurodivergent or have a diagnosis, but they might be displaying traits in the workplace. So the Buckland Review suggests that some of these difficulties might be overcome by employers implementing what it describes as inclusion by design. So this is where employers design their workspaces to be more inclusive so that workers can organise their own work environment to suit them without the need to disclose anything. So examples of this might be providing quiet rooms for any worker to work in as required. This could mean that a neurodivergent worker does not need to disclose their health needs to secure the support they need. It can reduce the need for separate reasonable adjustments and the stigma that this can sometimes entail, as well as improving overall productivity and reducing the employer's costs. The HMRC example is set out. So they built
Thank you, Asma. And if we could move on to the next slide, please, Donna. Thank you. So the traditional recruitment practices, including face-to-face interviews, competency questions, lengthy job descriptions, situational judgment tests, and so on, they're typically built with neurotypical people in mind. So the recruitment process can therefore be particularly difficult for individuals who are neurodivergent. And you can see some stats on the screen there. So a survey by Ambitious about autism found that 73% of autistic young people felt that being anxious about the application and interview process wasn't accessible, and actually it was the biggest barrier to them finding work. So there was the Buckland Review that Asmat referred to as well, which actually explains that interviews of the tell us about yourself and your achievements sort can actually put neurodivergent people at a disadvantage. So some autistic people, for example, may be overly honest about their weaknesses. They may struggle with eye contact. They may lack confidence because of previous bad experiences. So asking hypothetical or abstract questions can actually put those individuals, or some of those individuals, into a stressful and anxious state, which further impairs their interview performance. So in that Buckland Review, they also identified that, lengthy job descriptions, which cover every element of the role, may put individuals off of applying, particularly if they consider themselves to not have those essential requirements. So those nice to haves in a job are often described as must-haves, and that can dissuade neurodivergent candidates from applying more than others who might be more confident to do so. So I think the important takeaway there is just that more careful drafting is required when putting together job descriptions, and ensuring that they're clear. You're including what actually is a must-have and what is a nice to have in applicants, and also make sure that those job descriptions are concise and free of jargon as well. The other thing that I just wanted to mention, and this could be a session in itself, but is AI. So if you use AI for video interviews, for example, or at any other stage of the recruitment process, this could also be problematic for neurodiverse individuals for a number of reasons. But the systems are only as good as the data that is inputted into it. So it can have the same biases as individuals, as people, and it may also miss the nuances and the human element that a human might pick up. For example, tools that analyse eye contact in video interviews, they might unfairly penalise some neurodivergent applicants who might struggle with eye contact, for example. Furthermore, AI programs that are used to screen candidates might, for example, exclude someone with large gaps in their CV, which can include many neurodivergent people. So it's just being aware of those risks there, and always having a human in the loop to intervene and make sure that the processes are inclusive. So all of the points on the screen there need to be carefully considered and adjusted to avoid disadvantaging and discriminating against neurodivergent applicants. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Simple changes across the recruitment process can make it more inclusive for all. So there are some ideas and examples on this slide. I think it's important to just say at this point that these are just suggestions which make the application process smoother and more inclusive for all. But please remember that no one person is the same, and the duty to make reasonable adjustments for an individual person also still applies. So you do need to be looking at the individual's condition. But these are just some suggestions about making it generally more inclusive. So practical tests, assignments to be completed before interview, or short-term placements might better allow a neurodivergent candidate to demonstrate the skills required for a job. So going back to that Buckland review, that provides a helpful analogy. So if someone is applying for a job as a violinist, for example, in an orchestra, they're generally not asked to tell the interviewer something about their achievements playing the violin. Instead, they're asked to play it. So I think the point here is, depending on your organisation, it may be more appropriate to just replace in-person interviews with performance-based tasks, and that might be easier for a neurodivergent individual. You might also have heard of the recent example of John Lewis providing interview questions to candidates in advance. So this can be helpful and has been reported to reduce anxiety for all, but also in particular neurodivergent staff, and it generally makes the application process more accessible. A familiarisation session with the applicant in advance of the interview can also be a helpful way to get an informal chat in and reduce that anxiety felt in the lead up to the application process. It can sometimes help for the individuals to be aware of who they're going to be speaking to as part of their interview process, and also have a point of contact if they do need to raise any concerns or adjustments that are needed. Going back to that point about AI in recruitment, just make sure that if you are using it, you should be transparent about how the processes work. And as I said before, just make sure that you always have a human in the loop, and that person is contactable if any adjustments are required, because as I said, it's not always the most user-friendly for some individuals. The other thing I just wanted to mention was to train staff on unconscious biases. So when they interview, they're more aware. So for example, the initial reaction if someone avoids eye contact in an interview might be to be offended. However, it might be because the individual that's being interviewed finds face-to-face contact uncomfortable, doesn't like making eye contact. Another common misconception is that a culture fit is someone that uses the same body language, communication style as neurotypical staff. So if the interview themselves is neurotypical, then a neurodivergent applicant might appear rude or dismissive to that interviewer. So training people to understand that there might be reasons behind certain behaviours will help them to acknowledge the biases, and also hopefully ensure some more inclusion and diversity in the workplace. And a diversity and inclusion statement and policies as well can also be helpful tools to demonstrate that you're committed to making adjustments to the interview process and the role. And you can include these in your applicant packs as well, so that applicants know who to contact and also have those assurances in advance. So we have another case example for you on the next slide. So I'm just conscious of time, so I'll go through this one very quickly. But this one was a case where Mr. M had dyspraxia and applied for a role at ABC Limited. The applicants had to complete a short online application form, and he emailed the HR team attaching his CV and provided information about his dyspraxia and how this affected him. He asked, and this was in bold capitals, that they permit him to make an oral application rather than the online format because of his disability. A senior HR manager emailed him to explain that he needed to complete the online form, but he should let them know if he was struggling with any aspect of it. Mr. M didn't respond, and he did not explain specifically that his dyspraxia meant that he could not create a username and password to access the form. He replied to confirm that he was happy to do the online form over the phone and would prefer to make an oral application. And he did not telephone ABC Limited for fear of being laughed at due to his previous experience with another employer. The HR manager didn't call him. He was unable to make the application, and he ultimately brought a disability discrimination claim. So he argued that ABC Limited had failed to make reasonable adjustments. If you could just pop onto the Slido now and vote whether you think he won his claim of disability discrimination or not, that would be great. Just give it a moment for the results to come through. Yes, so the majority are saying that he did win, and that's correct. So this was a real case, and the case was Mallon and ACOM Limited, and it was actually an employment appeal tribunal decision of last year. But basically the tribunal made several comments, one of them being that even though Mr. M hadn't explicitly explained that he couldn't create a username and password, and that this was a specific disadvantage he was experiencing, the employer actually had constructive knowledge, so they should reasonably have been expected to know the substantial disadvantage that he was experiencing, because he'd put them on notice that he suffered with dyspraxia, and he explained that it was causing problems with the online form. There was no good reason either why no one could give him a call to figure out what his particular difficulty was, so it wasn't reasonable to expect an explanation by way of email based on the fact that he'd already explained he would prefer to speak on the phone and so on. So I think this case just highlights the importance of employers being proactive and responding to requests and so on. So I'll pass back over to Esmat now for some practical tips.
Hi, thanks, Poppy. So if I can have the next slide, please. So the tips on this slide are taken from the CIPD's Guide to Neuroinclusion. We'd really encourage reading this, as it's really clear and practical guide for employers, and it provides plenty of food for thought. You can access it online, and we've got a link on the next slide too. So you need to assess where you are now and commit to a long-term plan of action. It's not a race, and these things take time, and to get them right takes time. It's better to spend time and get it right than to kind of rush things in too quickly. So the important thing is demonstrating a lasting commitment to progress. So you need to focus on creating an open and supportive culture where people feel comfortable talking about neurodiversity. This is easier said than done, and again, it takes time to embed. We need to start talking about neurodiversity as an organisation, so people will more readily ask for support and perform at their best if they feel safe to do so, and they feel that people won't judge them or make inaccurate assumptions. So making sure your staff kind of understand how different people's brains work, how different conditions might affect them, and that kind of creates that open culture that means that people will feel more comfortable talking about it. You need to review all people management policies and processes to make them neuro-inclusive, from recruitment to training and development and career progression. It's important to take advice here and read around the topic to understand what neuro-inclusive policies and processes need to look like. Consulting with your neurodiverse staff is also a really good idea. So if you have some staff who are willing to give you some ideas and explain the difficulties that they face, then that can be really helpful. So you need to allow individual employees to be masters of their own journey. So normalise the conversations and listen, and don't assume what's best for people. So if somebody comes and tells you that they have autism, don't assume that there are certain things that they will struggle with, because it's a spectrum and everybody is different. And so each person's going to have different preferences and needs. So just making sure that you take those into account. Embrace flexible working wherever you can. It can really benefit the organisation as well as the individual. But even minor changes can make a big difference. So following recent changes in the law on flexible working, which happened in April 2024, it's likely that we're going to see more and more requests of this nature. So employers need to approach flexible working with a can-do attitude, or they're going to be left behind. Focusing on well-being. So sadly, a third of neurodivergent employees surveyed said that their experience at work in relation to their neurodivergence has had a negative impact on their mental well-being. The most neuro-inclusive organisations are constantly thinking about well-being, treating it as a never-ending journey towards excellence. You need to empower neurodivergent voices. So our own neurodivergent staff are often well placed to inform you of how the organisation can be more neuro-inclusive. So invite participation, but don't expect it. Some people might not be keen to do that. Internal networks can be helpful and leaders sharing their own stories, but don't over rely on or overburden colleagues, for example, with educating the organisation. They have their jobs, and the organisation itself needs to take the lead on improving EDI. So here is the link to some useful things to look at. Now, I think we'll send those around after the webinar, just for you to be able to refer to. What to do if you receive a complaint about a neurodiverse employee. So I appreciate we've hit 10:30 now, but I think this is quite an important one. So if anybody's able to stay and they want to listen, then please do, because we're just going to discuss challenges that you might encounter in kind of communications between different employees. So some individuals, for example, with autism, they might be more direct in their communication style. They might use less subtlety or euphemisms. So an employee with autism may give very direct feedback back to a colleague on their work, and they might go into quite a lot of detail on where they went wrong without softening the blow. And their colleague might interpret this as being rude or blunt and have an issue with the feedback style. So that might result in them raising a complaint about the autistic employee. So in these circumstances, the really important thing is not to take the complaint at face value and immediately discipline the autistic colleague for being rude without considering mitigating circumstances and how the colleague can be supported. So it might be beneficial to have a conversation with the autistic employee about their autism and in what ways it affects them. So in this conversation, it might be appropriate to share that a colleague has had an issue with their feedback style, but making sure that you're not doing this in an accusing way, but in a way to show them that you're trying to support them in the way that they deliver feedback. So perhaps if they have a checklist of things that they might need to do, that might be helpful. It might be that perhaps only providing written feedback or verbal, depending on the circumstances, and perhaps somebody else is able to look over that first and give them some pointers on perhaps softening the blow. So the focus should be on asking the employee on their barriers and how they can be removed, rather than accusing them. This also comes back to training and what training is given to all staff, because if the team understand that actually this employee isn't being rude, but they just have a different communication style, this might avoid complaints. And so there's some ways that this could be done. It might be, if the colleague with autism is happy, that it might be appropriate to explain to their team how the condition affects them, so that the team understands that when they're giving that very direct feedback, for example, it's actually just the way their autism manifests itself, rather than them actually being very rude. It might be that's appropriate. It might be that if that employee doesn't really want the focus to be on them, a more neutral way of doing it would be to give all staff training on neurodiversity. And this is going to help with everything in the organisation. So if all staff have that training and there's no particular focus on an individual, that can be a really good way of putting that into practice. So the last slide is obtaining a diagnosis. Now, I think Poppy's already gone through this really, but it's just that reminder that an employee does not have to have a diagnosis in order for it potentially to amount to a disability. As an employer, you don't need to diagnose an employee, you just need to help the employee with their performance. So you work with your employees to develop strategies to successfully resolve any issues. And make sure you document it just in case you do have those claims. Also, make use of your employee assistance programs if you have any of those, because they can be, they might be able to provide an assessment, they might be able to provide counselling, they might just be able to provide the employee with some help that they need. Okay, so now we're going to move on to questions, if anybody's got any questions, I think.
We do have a few questions, bearing in mind that we are we've run over a bit. What we will be doing is that we will respond to your questions offline. If you could pop your contact details either into the chat box or into the feedback form together with your question, we will be getting back to you with regard to those. So that leaves me with thanking you very much for attending our webinar today, and thank you very much to Reed Recruitment for supporting us, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.